everything was done with one microphone and direct to disc. So in other words, you'd gather your musicians around a microphone and cut it directly to disc. And the idea is that because there's really no mixer, there's just one microphone, you build your arrangement by planning out where your musicians are going to be sitting in proximity to that microphone. You'll notice that the string section is up front, the horns are up back, the tuba guy is way back there. So the louder an instrument is, the further away you are from the microphone. That's really the way that everything was cut from there. And we went from direct to disc, then to tape, but everything was either in mono or stereo until Multitrack arrives in 1955, the Ampex model 5258. And Les Paul, of all people, was the first client, and he became quite a pioneer in terms of Multitrack. And what did Multitrack give you? Well, Multitrack, for a start, gave you 8 separate tracks which you could record and then selectively erase and punch in on any particular track. So in other words, back in the last example, if somebody messed up when you're all just around one microphone, you had to start the whole recording again. In Multitrack, you don't need to do that. If one musician makes a mistake on, say, track 2, then you can go back and selectively re-record track 2, either the entire performance or else punch in or whatever. Another great thing about Multitrack is that all the musicians don't need to be in the same place at the same time. I remember growing up, and this is way back when Michael Jackson did a duet with Paul McCartney. I always thought it was amazing as a kid that they'd never actually met each other at that stage, that Michael was tracking in LA and Paul McCartney was tracking in London. So the whole idea of Multitrack makes your tracks non-synchronous in terms of when they were recorded, and also gives you all those benefits of being able to punch in and out. And then we went from there to Multitrack actually maturing, and we started getting to multi-million-dollar recording studios. And the truth is that average musician will never record in one, because you really need to be employed by some sort of major record label to be able to get into anything like this. But the big shift that happened here is that the actual studio started to become kind of an instrument in itself. You think about, some of the Queen records, all those multi-track, all those layering the vocals, it then really took performances to a whole new level. Now, adjacent to all of this, we had the home recording revolution that happened in the late 70s. This was Tascam's 144. I believe it was the predecessor to the 244 that I had. And the whole idea that you could record at home was very, very exciting. It hadn't been really available to anybody before this time, and people were getting some pretty decent results. It wasn't like they sounded like a multi-million-dollar recording studio, but most famously, Bruce Springsteen came out with an album, Nebraska, that was recorded on one of these actual units. So people were really starting to kind of get on the bandwagon here, and there was all of these home recording kind of setups. Everything was recorded on tape, and of course everything was recorded in audio format. But then what happened after that was the MIDI revolution. And in the 80s, a bunch of synthesizers, drum machines, and sequencers flood the market. And the great thing about the MIDI revolution is it all started, I've forgotten which particular NAMM show it was, but Sequential Circuits and Roland famously plugged a MIDI cable between one of Roland's synthesizers into Sequential Circuit synthesizers, and they could remotely play each other. And the whole idea behind the MIDI revolution is in the bottom left-hand corner, that's the QX3 by Yamaha. That's a sequencer where you could record the finger movements of your keyboard or your drum pads or something like that into that, and then that would play back a synthesizer live. And then you could go into note by note editing. You could do a bunch of things, but the big downside of that, the upside was that you could record whole performances with zero generation loss, because all you were doing was recording your finger movements. But the downside is you had to have a ton of hardware to play all that back. You'd look at a typical MIDI studio back in the day, and they'd have a wall of keyboards and synth modules and drum machines all to play back all of these tracks. So you had unlimited tracks, but you had to have just a ton of hardware to play that back. And then we went from there to 1996. Absolutely changed everything at the NAMM show that year. I remember it well. I was down there in Anaheim, California. Roland brought out the VS880, the very first affordable digital multitrack with non-linear editing. And when I say first affordable, I mean there were things before that, like Australia's Fairlight, about $500,000, or New England Digital's Synclavier, about the same price. Very, very expensive stuff. This is all stuff you could do on, a smartphone nowadays. But back in that time, it was amazing to be able to record. This had 8 tracks of non-linear digital recording. It didn't record onto tape or anything like that. It recorded onto hard disk. So it was a big, big change from there. And then we went on to the DAW revolution, the DAW revolution, digital audio workstation, where a lot of the sequences that started out on computers, things like Cubase, Logic, there was a bunch of sequences that were on computers that basically allow you to record MIDI data out. They started to add audio capabilities. It was quite expensive. You had to have specific computers. You quite often had to have extended hardware like special cards, and really fast at the time and expensive hard disk recorders. But that started really maturing, and then all of these DAWs started coming out and really started bringing all of that amazing stuff that you had in a high-end recording studio to the masses. So we went from recording straight to disc around one microphone to recording to tape, then multitrack, then $1 million studios along home project studios alongside, and then MIDI studios and DAW setups. But what I want you to take out of all of this is, while the gear we've used to record has changed a lot over the decades, the underlying principles of how you get excellent recordings and mix songs really don't change that much. If in 20 years from now we're all mixing using lasers and holograms, things like that, will you need to still know how to set up select microphones and placements? Think about it. Will you still need to know dBs and frequency neighborhoods? Absolutely. And that's why you need to nail down these unchanging principles. And I'm going to really drill them into you so that they're kind of second nature to you. So anyway, let's dive right in and look at the gear that you're going to need to equip your dream home studio.